sort of the social aspect of the late 1800s and the Gilded Age, and we're going to deal with some of the cultural progressions, some of the books, the literature, the press, education, advancement for African Americans, that sort of thing. So first we're going to start out with Darwin, because he made quite a scene. He bursts onto the scene with this book called Origin of Species, which was published in 1859, and what he says in there is that human beings evolved from lower life forms over a large amount of time, and the fittest of those survived. So it was survival of the fittest. We took the best of that population and they kept evolving. So this whole idea of evolution sort of throws out the notion that God created heaven and earth in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. Fundamentalist Christians, they weren't ready to buy this. You don't just throw out the Bible, according to them. And so your conservatives, your fundamentalists, this led to a real uproar. And we know later on in history, in the 1920s, there would be a whole court case over whether or not this could be taught in school as scientific fact or not. It's still being fought over today. Look at the case in Lancaster a couple of years ago. Education in African Americans. Now, education overall, the standards have increased. Like any time period, education always raises its standards. They did in the 1800s as well. The number of people attending elementary schools, that also goes up quite a bit. More high schools are formed, more colleges spring up in this time. But the nice thing about elementary school was when you have children attending elementary school, teachers get to see them every single day, and they can sort of keep an eye out for things like child abuse or child labor abuse. If the kids were being unruly punished, the teachers would see that and be able to report it and somewhat help protect the child. Now, as far as African American education went, 44% of African Americans in 1890 were illiterate. So this was it was very hard to get African Americans sort of up to par with white America. And there was going to be three people who sort of emerge at the forefront of African American education. Two of them are divergent in their views. Booker T. Washington is one of them. He was called upon to head up Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Now, if you remember, during World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen were the ones who escorted the fighter bombers into Germany to drop their payloads. They came out of Tuskegee Institute, the same Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. It was a technical trade school. A lot of engineers come out of Tuskegee Institute. So what his theory is, we have to teach useful skills to African Americans in order for them to gain equality. So in order to make them somewhat financially successful and on par with white America, we have to teach useful skills. I'll tell you why there's a disagreement with him in a minute. George Washington Carver also comes onto the scene, and he's an agricultural chemist. He's an African-American man. He was an agricultural chemist, and he really does a lot for the Southern economy because he takes those agricultural products in the South, soybeans, peanuts, that sort of thing, and he shows how you can use them for different applications. So peanuts were used for shampoo and axle grease. Soybeans were used for paint and a multitude of other purposes. But he demonstrates how to do that, so it really boosts the Southern economy. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, he disagrees wholeheartedly with Booker T. Washington. And what he says is what Washington is doing by teaching these useful skills is he's keeping African Americans down and suppressed because he's teaching them how to be manual laborers. No good. We want to raise the standards for African Americans. We want them to be physicists and doctors and lawyers and such. So he disagrees with Booker T. Washington because he thinks that he's holding African Americans down and he wants them raised, they're elevated in American society right away. He's going to found the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Still active today. Now, colleges. The number of colleges goes up after the Civil War. It increases, and they also become quite different because they become co-ed, a lot of colleges. Not all. A lot of private schools still single-sex. My alma mater, University of Scranton, remained all male until 1970s. So, but a lot of colleges go co-ed at this time, public universities especially. By 1900, 25% of college graduates are women. So this is pretty cool. Now, a couple of acts are passed through Congress to help stimulate the building of state universities and help them get the funding they need to provide a good education. The Morel Act is passed during the Civil War in 1862, and that's going to give land grants for state schools. So this is why you see state schools on huge chunks of land, and they were able to get that land pretty cheaply from the federal government in order to establish them. So Penn State University, Ohio State University, NC State. I can't believe I had to say NC State and Duke in the same unit. This is killing me. But those colleges all got money from the land from the Morel Act of 1862. Now, the Hatch Act also comes along in 1887, and that's going to give money to these state schools for agricultural programs. So when you go to Penn State, you can major in agricultural science. You can major in animal husbandry. You can do all the things that are agriculturally related because of the Hatch Act. NC State has an incredible veterinary science program. Same thing there. So millionaires are also going to contribute to the building of colleges, and we have some of them that are named directly after the millionaires: Vanderbilt, Cornell, Stanford, okay, Carnegie Mellon. But we also have the University of Chicago. Excellent school, by the way, all of them are. University of Chicago was funded by Rockefeller, largely. Now, the press, they're going to make a difference as well in the society post-Civil War, Gilded Age. The Library of Congress is formed in 1897, and it's the #1 collection in the world. It's the biggest collection in the world of books and written work. We still love the Library of Congress today. You guys know I pass you on documents all the time to read from .loc, Library of Congress. Newspapers, full of sensationalism. They wanted to sell papers, so they had to make their stories as sensational as possible, even if it meant telling a little white lie occasionally. Joseph Pulitzer ran the New York World. He's one of the most famous newspapermen to come out of our history. The Pulitzer Prize is, of course, named after him. He's going to fill his newspaper up with yellow journalism, which is that idea of sensationalism. Make it as sensationalistic as possible in order to sell papers. It's no good if they're sitting on the shelf. They got to be sold. William Randolph Hearst, another great newspaperman, he builds himself an empire of newspapers, but his most famous was, of course, the San Francisco Examiner. That would be his sort of flagship. Literature. Big-time literature. There's lots and lots of authors. They're in your book. You should probably read that. But we're going to talk about a couple. Edwin Godkin, he runs the New York Nation, really pushes for civil service reform and an honest government. So he was out there to sort of make a difference in a positive way. Henry George writes a work called Progress and Poverty, and what he says is that the value of land in this country has gone up tremendously because the availability of land for people to buy is down because of all the railroads getting land, other people settling on it, and so forth. So supply and demand tells us that land prices are really, really up because the demand is up, but the supply is down. So he says these people that sold this land and speculated on land and came across all this money that they now have because they're rich, they came across that money sort of immorally. So they don't deserve it. They didn't earn it. So he proposes a 100% tax on the earnings from land speculation. That doesn't happen. But that's what he proposes in Progress and Poverty. Horatio Alger comes along. He writes a lot of young fiction books that are based in Puritan values. So we see a lot of Puritan values coming out at this time in the written work. You see the book Ben-Hur being written by General Lew Wallace, who was also a governor. And Ben-Hur would go on to sell something like 2 million copies. It was incredible. Mark Twain, he writes, of course, the adventures of Huck Finn, the adventures of Tom Sawyer, the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County. I can't even say it. But Mark Twain, very active writer in this time. Now, finally, we have morality in women. So several things happen here. As far as the moral values go, Victoria Woodhull comes along and she proposes free love. That people should be free to love whoever they want to love, and you know, sexual deviance was okay. She's countered by a man named Anthony Comstock, who Comstock, who wages a war on the immoral. He goes after anything that is seen as pornographic at that time, and you could imagine how conservative the pornographic definition was at that time. But he goes after them with such vengeance that 15 people commit suicide because of his attacks. Kind of scary, this guy, maybe a loon. And women, because they are feeling more educated, more free, more equal, things change socially for them. Divorce rates go up, okay, because women feel like they can leave their guy or their husband, right? Birth control use goes up. It was pretty primitive back then, but the use of birth control increases among women. They didn't necessarily want to have a child every year. They wanted to control that process. Discussions of sexual topics, open discussions of sexual topics were on the increase. This was kind of strange for American society. So that's the development there.